all know those stories, right? The ones that really stick with you, the supposed real-life horrors that fuel nightmares and, well, endless debate. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most infamous of them all, the Amityville Horror.
A story that just keeps gripping us, even decades later. We're looking at this house on Long Island that, became a household name, synonymous with something truly terrifying.
Exactly. And our goal today is to really try and get under the skin of the Amityville Horror. We've gathered a whole bunch of sources, articles, investigations, accounts from people on, both sides of the fence.
Right.
And we're going to try and unpack what might have actually happened, sort of separating what's documented fact from what's, well, claimed.
And the Amityville story, it really has two main parts, doesn't it? First, you have the incredibly disturbing murders of the DeFeo family.
Awful.
And then you get the subsequent, very sensational accounts of paranormal stuff reported by the Lutz family, the ones who moved in after.
Absolutely. 6 members of the DeFeo family brutally killed in that house. A horrific crime, just by any measure.
Yeah.
Then the Lutz family moves in, and suddenly the whole narrative shifts, like from a murder scene to a potentially haunted house, and on a grand scale.
And that's where the controversy really kicks in, Was this house genuinely a hotspot for supernatural activity? Yeah. Or could there be other explanations for what the Lutzes said happened? Skepticism has been a massive part of the story almost from day one.
So the core questions we're tackling today, they seem simple, but the answers are anything but clear-cut. Was the Amityville house truly haunted?
Or was it maybe a story that just kind of grew? Maybe even intentionally.
Right. And ultimately, what does this whole saga tell us about what we choose to believe, what we tend to doubt, and just how powerful a really well-told story can be?
It was fascinating.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this by looking at the terrible events that first put 112 Ocean Avenue in the spotlight.
Yeah.
The DeFeo murders.
Right. The undeniable foundation for this whole thing is the night of November 13th, 1974, in their home, right there in Amityville, Long Island.
Mm-hmm.
Ronald DeFeo Jr., he was 23 at the time, murdered his parents, Ronald Sr. and Louise DeFeo, and also his 4 younger siblings, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John Matthew.
Just a truly devastating event for that community. The sheer brutality of it is hard to even comprehend.
Yeah.
He used a .35 Marlin rifle, shot them while they were asleep, 6 people in their beds.
And initially, DeFeo Jr., he tried to play it like he was the grieving survivor, right? It suggested it was some kind of mob hit. But his story, well, it fell apart pretty quickly. He eventually confessed to the murders. And what's particularly chilling, I think, is his claim that voices told him to do it.
Voices. Yeah, that's a detail that adds this really disturbing layer to the whole Amityville narrative, even before you get to any haunting claims.
Exactly. He was convicted 6 counts of second-degree murder, November 1975. And he stayed in prison until he died, which was March 2021.
Okay, and this is really important, right? During the whole investigation, the trial for the DeFeo murders, there was nothing. No reports, no hint of anything supernatural going on in the house.
Absolutely zero credible reports.
Wow.
The horror at 112 Ocean Avenue back then was, well, it was entirely down to a very real, very human act of violence.
Right. A tragedy, a crime, not a ghost story at that point. And the house, it just sat empty for quite a while afterwards. 13 months.
13 months. You can almost, imagine the silence in that house after something like that.
Yeah.
Which sets a very specific stage for what comes next. December 1975, George and Kathy Lutz and Kathy's 3 kids, Daniel, Christopher, and Melissa, plus their dog Harry, they all move into 112 Ocean Avenue.
And you can see why this part grabbed people's attention, right? Here's this new family, and they deliberately choose to move into a house with that kind of dark public history. They even got it for what was seen as, a significantly reduced price, $80,000.
A price cut directly because of the murder's notoriety. They knew exactly what had happened there, fully aware, yet they still decided, okay, this is our home now.
And what's also pretty striking is that a lot of the DeFeo family's furniture was apparently still in the house.
Yeah, the Lutzes bought it for an stray, what, $400?
$400. That's a pretty constant, tangible reminder of the events that had just happened there.
It certainly adds another dimension, doesn't it, to their reported experiences. So shortly after they moved in, a friend of George Lutz apparently insisted they get the house blessed.
Okay.
This brings in Father Ray, who they called Father Mancuso in the book, for privacy, a Catholic priest.
And this blessing, this is where the story really pivots towards the supernatural, according to their account. Father Mancuso supposedly heard this really clear masculine voice just tell him, get out.
Right, as he was sprinkling holy water, starting to pray. Just Get out.
And interestingly, he didn't immediately tell the Lutzes about this, did he?
No. He contacted George Lutz a few days later, actually on Christmas Eve, telling him to stay away from one specific room upstairs. It was the former bedroom of 2 of the murdered DeFeo kids. But the phone call apparently just got cut off by static.
And the book goes even further, claiming Father Mancuso himself had some pretty disturbing physical reactions after trying the blessing, like a high fever, blisters on his hands. Even compared them to stigmata.
Yeah, the book really leans into that. Initially, though, the Lutzes themselves, they didn't report anything overtly like ghostly. They later described it more as a feeling like each of them was experiencing different unsettling things separately.
Okay.
But by mid-January 1976, after they tried doing another blessing themselves, that's when they claimed they had their final terrifying night. And they've always been pretty vague about what exactly happened that night, just describing it as too frightening to talk about.
And then boom. Just 28 days after moving in, the Lutz family flees 112 Ocean Avenue. Left everything behind, all their possessions.
Everything. And they even claimed the phenomena, whatever it was, followed them to Kathy's mother's house over in Deer Park.
That's quite a claim, a dramatic exit, to say the least.
It is. But interestingly, a mover who went into the house later to get their stuff, he reported absolutely nothing unusual. No weird feelings, no spooky events, nothing.
Okay, so this is where the book comes in, The Amityville Horror by Jay Anson. And it was based on, about 45 hours of tape recordings from George and Kathy Lutz?
Exactly. Their personal account, recorded on tape, became the foundation for this huge phenomenon.
And Anson basically took that narrative and, shaped it into this incredibly compelling horror story.
Oh, absolutely. And the book was just an enormous success, sold like an estimated 10 million copies. It really cemented the Amityville story in pop culture and, of course, launched a whole parade of movies.
This whole franchise, still going, unbelievably. But behind all that sensationalism, the book, the films, there's this significant counter-narrative, right? A really strong case put forward by skeptics. Okay, let's dive into this other side of the story.
Yeah, we need to. The accuracy of the Amityville Horror book has faced some serious challenges. And one of the first, loudest critics was William Weber.
Okay, wait. William Weber. He was Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s defense attorney, wasn't he?
The very same one. Kind of ironic. He later made this, pretty explosive claim. Said that he, George, and Kathy Lutz basically created this horror story over many bottles of wine.
Wow, for financial gain, presumably?
That was the implication.
Yeah.
Specifically for financial gain.
That's a really serious accusation, especially coming from someone so closely involved with the original tragedy. It definitely makes you wonder about motives. Weren't the Lutzes reportedly having some money troubles around then?
That's correct. Their financial situation wasn't great. It was kind of public record. And skeptics jumped on that, arguing that, the chance of a big book deal, movie rights, that could have been a pretty strong incentive to maybe exaggerate things.
Yeah.
Or even invent them.
Right. Beyond just Weber's claims, though, there were also some, let's say, noticeable inconsistencies between the Lutz's story and the actual house layout.
Yes, things didn't quite match up. The way rooms were described, or even whether certain features existed.
Like the Red Room. That sounded pretty terrifying in the book.
Exactly. The book paints it as this hidden, scary chamber down in the basement. But in reality, it was just a small closet, not hidden at all. Something the Lutzes would almost certainly have known about when they bought the place.
Okay. And what about corroboration, like from neighbors? If a house is supposedly going completely haywire with paranormal activity, swarms of flies, slime, levitation, you'd think someone nearby might notice something.
You would think so, but nope. No neighbors ever reported seeing or hearing anything out of the ordinary during those 28 days the Lutzes were there. And what's more, despite the book and the first movie showing police showing up because of disturbances, police records show the Lutzes never actually called them. Not once during that whole alleged siege.
Okay, that's significant. Then there are some of those really specific, dramatic claims, like the cloven hoof prints in the snow. That always stood out to me.
It's a very vivid image, isn't it? But investigators actually checked weather records. Turns out there was no snowfall in Amityville on January 1st, 1976.
Which is when the Lutzes claimed they found the prints.
Exactly. So that particular detail seems factually impossible.
Right. And then there's the family who bought the house after the Lutzes left, the Cromartys. They lived there for a good while, didn't they?
10 years. James and Barbara Cromarty bought it in March 1977, lived there a whole decade.
Right.
And they reported absolutely nothing unusual, zero.
And they also pushed back on the Lutz's claims about physical damage, right? Like doors ripped off hinges, broken locks.
Yeah, they disputed all that, said everything looked original, maybe old, but in basically good condition. No signs of the kind of damage the Lutzes described.
Okay, another claim in the book was about the land itself, that the house was built on a site where the local Shinnecock tribe used to, like, abandon the sick or mentally ill.
Right, another dramatic historical layer added in the book. But local Shinnecock representatives, they strongly refuted that. Said, first off, their historical lands were further east on Long Island, and second, they absolutely never had any such practice. Called it completely false.
It really seems like almost every major element of the Lutz's story has faced some kind of pushback or contradiction. Even the priest, Father Pecoraro, his story wasn't entirely consistent either.
That's right. It gets complicated.
Yeah.
In a legal affidavit, he apparently stated his only contact with the Lutzes was just by phone.
Okay.
But then later, in a 1979 interview, he claimed he'd actually visited the house, felt like he was slapped by some unseen force, and heard a disembodied voice telling him to leave. So you have these conflicting accounts from him, too.
It just adds more confusion. And speaking of legal stuff, this whole thing got tangled up in lawsuits, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. The legal battles around Amityville are pretty messy. The Lutzes sued William Weber and some others. That case got dismissed, though, and the judge actually raised ethical concerns about Weber and a psychic involved. Okay. Weber sued the Lutzes, too. And then the Cromarties, the people who bought the house later, they sued the Lutzes, J. Anson, the publisher.
Wow.
And during that Cromartie lawsuit trial, the Skeptical Inquirer magazine reported something pretty stunning, that the Lutzes admitted under oath that virtually everything in the book was fiction.
Virtually everything. If that report is accurate, that's a huge admission.
It's a bombshell, if true.
But then how do you explain the polygraph tests? George and Kathy Lutz took lie detector tests, and the report said they passed, right? Indicated no deception.
Ah, the polygraphs. Yes, they took them, and the examiner concluded they weren't lying. And this is a huge, but polygraph tests are, well, notoriously unreliable.
Right, they aren't foolproof.
Not even close. The scientific community largely dismisses them. They measure stress responses, heart rate, breathing, sweat, which can be linked to lying, but also just to anxiety, fear, or even discomfort. They aren't admissible as evidence in many courts for a reason. They just can't definitively tell if someone's lying.
So passing a polygraph doesn't automatically mean the story is true.
Not at all. And perhaps one of the strongest points for the skeptical side is, well, pretty straightforward. Every single owner of that house since the Lutzes left in 1976 has publicly stated they've experienced absolutely nothing paranormal.
Nothing at all?
Nothing. That's a pretty consistent record of, normalcy following the Lutz family's very dramatic 28 days.
It really does make you wonder, if the house was genuinely possessed or cursed or whatever, why would the activity just suddenly stop the moment the Lutzes moved out?
Exactly. It definitely lends weight to the argument that maybe the haunting, quote-unquote, was somehow tied specifically to them, or at least to their claims.
And we should probably mention Stephen Kaplan, too. He was initially involved, wasn't he? A paranormal investigator type.
Yeah, a self-styled vampirologist and ghost hunter. He looked into it early on, but became a really vocal critic later. He even wrote a book, The Amityville Horror Conspiracy, basically tearing down the Lutz's story. Pointed out all sorts of inconsistencies, like descriptions of Father Pecораro's car changing between different editions of Anson's book. Small details, but they add up.
All these inconsistencies, contradictions, the lawsuits, it does chip away pretty significantly at the credibility of the original haunting story.
It really does. And yet, despite all the skepticism, all the evidence against it, the Amityville horror story has had this undeniable, lasting impact on our culture, hasn't it?
Absolutely. It just won't go away. Which makes you wonder why. Why does it still resonate so strongly?
Well, a big part of that enduring legacy has to be the involvement of Ed and Lorraine Warren.
Ah, the Warrens. Right. They investigated the house, too, didn't they? March 1976.
They did. And their investigation produced that, that very famous, very creepy photograph. The one supposedly showing a demonic boy peeking out from a doorway.
Yeah, I've seen that picture. It's unsettling.
And the Warrens, being who they were, huge names in paranormal investigation, they were convinced. They believed the house was genuinely occupied by malevolent spirits, linking it back to the violent history, the DeFeo murders.
And other paranormal figures like Hans Holzer kind of echoed that sentiment.
Yes. Holzer also suggested similar findings. The involvement of people like the Warrens and Holzer definitely added a layer of, perceived legitimacy to the haunting claims for a lot of people.
And then came the movies. So many movies. The first big one in 1979, then the remake in 2005, and just countless sequels, prequels, spin-offs.
It became a genre staple.
And many of them take huge liberties with the original story, right? But that image, the house with those distinctive, like, eye-shaped windows, that's become iconic.
Totally iconic. It's like the visual shorthand for haunted house. Even though the actual house, the real 112 Ocean Avenue, has been renovated since then, those quarter-round windows, they're gone now.
Really? They changed them?
Yeah, presumably to make it less recognizable, less of a tourist magnet. But the image from the book cover in the first movie, that persists in everyone's mind.
And it's interesting, George Lutz actually trademarked the Amityville Horror name back in 2002.
He did. And he often complained that the movies, especially the later ones, just embellished things or completely fabricated events that weren't even in the original book.
And the house itself, it's still there in Amityville.
Still standing. But the address has been changed, apparently multiple times, again, to try and discourage people from showing up.
You can understand why the local residents and authorities wouldn't be thrilled with the constant attention.
Oh, definitely not. They're reportedly pretty unhappy about the whole thing, the reputation it gives the town. They generally just avoid talking about it publicly. Even the Amityville Historical Society, their website makes zero mention of the DeFeo murders or the Lutz family. It's like they want to pretend it never happened.
Trying to erase that chapter. But then you get things like that 2013 documentary, My Amityville Horror. Daniel Lutz, one of the kids, he participated in that.
Right. And in it, he largely supports the original story his parents told.
Yeah.
He echoes the main claims, but also adds some new layers, talking about alleged possessions, claiming George Lutz was dabbling in the occult.
Which just adds another level of complexity, doesn't it? It shows how personal experience, memory, especially from childhood trauma, can shape someone's belief, regardless of, external proof or lack thereof.
Absolutely. Daniel Lutz's account, whether you believe it or not, suggests his experiences felt very real to him. It really underscores how subjective memory can be and how powerfully these kinds of events can affect individuals, especially kids caught up in something so intense.
And it's worth remembering both George and Kathy Lutz have since passed away.
They have. Which leaves us with their recorded accounts, the book, the significant skepticism surrounding it all, and this cultural phenomenon that just keeps going.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here, where does that leave us? It really feels like the central mystery of the Amityville Horror is still, stubbornly unresolved.
Yeah, there's no smoking gun, is there? No definitive proof that absolutely confirms a supernatural haunting, but also nothing that completely 100% proves it was all a hoax either, despite the strong evidence pointing that way.
It's this really compelling mix, isn't it? True crime, horrific true crime, blended with these wild supernatural claims, and it all gets filtered through, very human things. Belief, doubt, the desire for fame or money, maybe even genuine fear.
It's a fascinating case study in how a story can just take on a life of its own, how it can shape perceptions, tap into our fears, and become much bigger than the original events.
So you've heard the details, the arguments for and against, the inconsistencies, the counterclaims. What are your takeaways? What do you, listening now, make of this whole enduring, unsettling story?
I think this whole episode really drives home how important it is to, critically examine extraordinary claims, to really look for that corroborating evidence or lack thereof, and to consider all the different factors that might influence how someone remembers or tells a story. It makes you think hard about that line between subjective experience and objective reality.
It certainly does. And it leaves me thinking, maybe the real horror of Amityville isn't about ghosts or demons or slime. Maybe it lies somewhere else entirely.
Like where?
Well, maybe it's in the complex, often dark corners of human psychology. Maybe it's about the undeniable pull of notoriety, the power of suggestion, and just the incredible lasting impact that a really compelling story, even if it might be, largely unsubstantiated, can have on all of us, on our collective imagination.
That's definitely something.